Welcome to Becoming Church, the podcast where we discuss how the message and movement of Jesus is not just about becoming Christians, but about becoming the church. I'm your host, Kristin Mockler-Young, and I'm so glad you are joining the conversation. All right, welcome back to Becoming Church. Now listen, I am going to say a word, listeners, and I do not want you to hit pause, okay? Take a deep breath. We can do this together. 1, 2, 3, deconstruction. All right, stay with me. Don't pause, don't move on. My guest today is a self-appointed messy middle Christian, and she's going to use her experience and her insight to get us through this and to help guide us back toward Jesus, regardless of wherever we are in our spiritual journey. So Kate Boyd, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, we're excited to have you. Do you feel like that's a common thing? You say deconstruction now and people just like start running for the hills.
It depends on who I'm around.
Yeah,
there are a lot of different responses in a lot of different communities. And so it's really interesting. And that's sort of what's fascinating is like watching people run away, but like run away for various reasons, or people who are willing to like stick around and talk about it, or there's so many different ways it can go.
Yes. Well, and we're going to get into it too. And we're going to kind of define it a little bit. But before we do that, you wrote a book that I've got right here in my hands called An Untidy Faith, Journeying Back to the Joy of Following Jesus. And I'm going to tell you, this book is making me say a word that I really try to stay away from a lot. And that's the word journey. Sometimes I think that can be overused, but there's going to be no escaping it today because you have packaged this. It's such a cute little way. Like you talk about passports and luggage, and it's so adorable. What made travel kind of like the metaphor? What made you choose that for this book?
It's because travel was what prompted my own journey, like my inner faith journey, as much as like the external one. And you'll get that in the book too. There's lots of stories from the places that I've been, but it's because travel and experiencing the church or seeing the world in different ways and in different places that really sort of caused me to reconsider a lot of things. And so it felt like the right thing because I wanted to honor the people who, have sort of been the people who pushed me, even though they never would know that, just because of meeting them and getting to see them and them doing their faith in their context made me reconsider mine.
Yeah. And I know you get into it in the book, but was there one place in particular or one place that you traveled that really kind of like started this journey for you of opening your eyes and reconsidering things?
I would say like all of them sort of did it to a degree, but the one that probably had the most impact on me early on was a trip to South Asia that I took. I went to 2 different countries. One was very Hindu, one was very Buddhist, and just sort of like seeing not only how people lived their faith, but also the contexts in which they lived, where there was much more opposition to their faith because of, the major religions were not Christianity. And even seeing some of what that looked like in practice. It was hard. And it made me just like really think about how easy I have it in a lot of ways, and then B, how complacent that made me. And so that really sort of like, once you start pulling that thread, it's really kind of hard to stop.
Well, it's almost a forced perspective shift, right? To be in another country, in another culture and go, oh, I don't actually have the luxury of seeing things through my typical little comfortable bubble. And so that's really the only option. So in your introduction, you wrote the most beautiful invitation for people. You said, if you love Jesus, but you're feeling distant from his people, this could be the journey you need. And I love this. And don't worry about your baggage. There's plenty of space and we'll even unpack some of it together. I was like, this is so beautiful and so just inclusive. So was there someone in particular that you wrote this book for, or was it just kind of like something that told you now was the time to write it?
Yeah. So when I first started wanting to write a book, it was about how we talked about church and how we could do better, because at the height of the pandemic, I really didn't like how people talked about the church, or what church was. And because of my overseas experiences, I was like, guys, we can't do this because you're discounting like most of the world when you put it right. And so that's really where I started. And then as sort of a community built up around that, people who were just sort of like journeying through what it meant to be the church or lead a church or be a part of a church, especially as like a lot of things were changing over the last 3 or 4 years in our personal lives and in our church spaces. I think I just kind of like realized that the community that came around actually needed something that was like a step before that, right? Which was sort of, and so it was really just like a lot of listening and a lot of conversation. And so it wasn't really for one person in particular, although it's kind of the book that I wish I had 10 years ago when this all started for me. But it certainly was also a book that, I just sort of sensed in my community and through the conversations that we were having or the topics that kept coming up when they would ask questions, that this sort of felt like the move for like the book that needed to be in the world at this point versus another.
Yeah. Well, and I would say too, following you for a while, I guess we've been internet friends for a couple of years now. But I think you're very good at, I stay away from Twitter because it scares me, but I know you're there a lot.
And fair enough, it's scary.
But you use Twitter really, really well. And obviously, I follow you on Instagram and so I know how you do it there, but I've delved into Twitter to see some of your threads. And so all of that just to validate not only your life experience, but definitely that you have your finger on like the pulse of community and what people are saying right now. And you don't shy away from the hard questions. Like you've put out questions before for people to answer. And I'm like, oh no, like what are people going to say to this? But yeah, I just think it just really validates like, everything that you have to say here.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, and I'm genuinely curious how people think about things. Like I know that I don't have, an expert opinion on everything or even every point of view. And so that's one thing that I think Twitter is good for, is just sort of like being a space to collect those if it can be done respectfully, which is maybe sometimes where we fall down. But posing as a a questioner, a curious person instead of an expert, though you can sort of unpack things that way too there, I find has been really helpful in my own, shaping my own imagination or my own thought processes. So it can be scary on Twitter, but there are good things there too.
I feel like you just said basically curiosity over expertise. Don't you feel like that is a key piece to deconstructing, reimagining, relearning, whatever it is you want to call it?
Yeah, I always sort of say like the twin values of like curiosity and humility will get you a lot of places. Like at this point, I know what my convictions are, but I also understand how other people have come to theirs. And so I'm willing to hold that loosely and say that can also be a biblical interpretation, right? But understanding that there are multiple and even knowing that there's so much that I don't know yet, there's so many perspectives that I have yet to dive into, and so, I try to hold those really closely, so that there can be a lot of dialogue and openness, and even try to encourage that. Like, I mean, even Instagram gets kind of rowdy sometimes. And so when people try to, come through and I'm just like, look, I respect that you have a different conviction, but I came to mine with a lot of time and effort and prayer and study. And so you can hold yours, but if you don't like that we hold multiple ones here, then this isn't the place for you. And you're going to constantly be disappointed. In what we say.
And you are welcome to go be certain in your little corner of the internet.
Yeah, but over here, you don't have to be here, and you can keep yelling at me, but that's not going to change my mind.
Right. We don't have to be certain here, especially not when someone else is dictating to us exactly what that looks like. All right. So let's address the word deconstruction that I at the beginning. What does it mean to you? And what was your experience with it like?
So I think sort of at its core, and though it takes a lot of different shapes, deconstruction is really just like an examination process. And everyone goes through that process differently. But I think it's an examination of like your core values and the beliefs that you hold, and just sort of like being willing to look at all of those things very, very carefully, and, and even being willing to let go of them sometimes, right? And being willing to reshape those, or even being willing, again, goes back to like curiosity and humility, being willing to change your mind, being willing to be wrong, as you sort of like sift through things. So for me, that's sort of like what it is at its core. I actually call my process disentangling, because I found that when I went overseas, it wasn't so much that I lost faith in who Jesus is, or what good there was in the vision of God, or in the idea of the church. And instead, for me, it was mostly realizing that a lot of the things that I had sort of counted as very essential were actually very cultural for me. And so understanding that we could have the same idea, but it would look something different, a different way in a different context, or even things like women in ministry, it doesn't make sense to exclude women from ministry in a lot of contexts, because they're the believers, right? They're the most mature believers. And so stuff like that I was like, okay, if it's supposed to be like this main principle, then it has to be able to apply everywhere. Now that might look differently in how it applies, but it has to be able to apply everywhere. And so for me, that sort of became my standard. If it's biblical, it needs to be global. And so I just sort of like kept sifting through until I found something that felt like a global, something that could be applied even in various ways through that. So I would say like mine was maybe more of a gentle and long-term deconstruction, in the sense of I actually got to like sit and hold up my beliefs and really like sift those through. And some of those ideas of like how they acted out in church culture were sort of revealed to me too, but I don't think it's anything like what we're seeing in the last few years, when it's more social issues that have prompted people to start the process, which I think is very different. So I often say that I had sort of like the luxury of deconstructing a long time ago, because I could take my time. There wasn't a lot of social upheaval for me. That came later. And so I wasn't doing that all at once. And I think for some people, they're sort of doing it all at once. And that's why it sort of feels extra.
Do you think that people feel like they're rushed through it, or they're on some kind of like, because you said you have, the luxury of taking your time with it. Do you think that if it's different now for people that are coming out of political, social injustice, whatever it is that gets them there?
I think it certainly feels more overwhelming. Like I think there are things that they just sort of, I think in some ways you just sort of like click and something switches and you change your mind. And that's just not how I process anyway. Things like that, it still would have taken me a long time either way. But I think when you start to see that juxtaposition that we've sort of been seeing, that's like in some church cultures and then in some, outside societal justice-y things, and you start seeing that clash. I think for a lot of people, it's happening more swiftly, more deeply, and certainly in a much more overwhelming sense for most people. And I think some people are still sort of like have their like, God is good, church is good, just not the ones I was a part of kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of people, and that's like all the people who are sort of around in my community, that's where they are. They're just not sure what that looks like, or haven't found a place necessarily for themselves now. But there's still people who are, holding on to some of that. And then there are some people who have like, gone further on the spectrum of like maybe losing faith or moving like increasingly more not needing to hold some of those essentials that like I would say are important to me.
Yeah. And it means such different things to different people. I actually love the idea of disentangling versus, like you said, just like flipping a switch, because I don't think it works that way. I do think there is a moment, right? There's something that makes you go, oh, wait, hold on. Like your eyes are open to something, or there has to be that moment, right? That kind of starts it. But then it really does feel like a process of my friend Aaron Moon always talks about it, about like untangling a necklace chain, you know, how like if a necklace gets all tangled up and how hard it is and how tedious. And just when you think you're like, you've got that piece to come out, then you're like, oh, there's another knot here. And it really is just a process of like, until you get there and until you get it all quote unquote, like straightened out, it can be frustrating.
Yeah. And I think too, what sort of happened is that like, so I also think of deconstruction a lot of times as sort of a cycle of grief. Like we're all sort of going through and you go through those different phases. And so what happened was everyone went through anger phase at the same time. Right. Yep. And so like, because it all sort of started for people at the same time, the ways in which they're handling it, and it sort of fuels, right, all of that sort of like, we need to be fast, we need to be bold, we need to do all of this without, and, you know, there's good things to some of that anger. Good things have come of some of those things. But when you're not able to take that time to heal yourself before you go out there and try to do a lot of other things, I think people are now starting to sort of like feel that strain of that and the ways in which they haven't walked through more of their grief. And it's hard, right? Like it's hard to do that. And so I think there's a lot of I think in some ways it also has prolonged the feeling of the loss that happens in deconstruction, even if so like now their feelings and their bodies are catching up to what their minds have been doing for a few years. And I think that's sort of like what we're seeing a lot of now.
I think too, it's so personal, not it can be. It's so personal, but if they started deconstructing during the pandemic or when it all of a sudden like blew up, like you said, everybody got mad all at one time, right? A lot of people started doing this all at once. I think that probably prolonged the process, because I know, at least for myself, I can find myself in an echo chamber of anger where I'm like, all the social media accounts, I'm telling myself, right, I'm listening to like deconstructing and other Christians and blah, blah, blah. But if I really take a step back, I can see seasons where, yes, maybe that's what they were talking about, but it was all negative. It was all rooted in anger. Like none of it was healing. None of it was grieving. Yeah. And so I think that we can accidentally find ourselves doing that as well. Grieving is really such a beautiful way to talk about it, because it is. It's a hard process to let go of things that you clung to, so tightly. And then even if there's better on the other side, right? It's still the process of letting it go.
It's still a loss, right? You're losing a lot of your identity, which I think is like the hardest part, for me, being good Christian church girl was my whole gig, right? So, same. Like what happens when what you thought that was built on shifts, and it shifts a lot of you, and then it eventually, right, shifts some of your relationships and your community dynamic, and like there is real loss in the process. Identity. And I think we don't always talk about it.
Yeah. So there's trying to stay away from the negativity of it. You have figured out how to like tug at the threads, quote unquote, in a way that feels more expansive instead of destructive. Instead of going, everything is awful, throw it all out. You found yourself in a bigger faith space. How were you able to do that?
Part of it is because, again, my sort of quote unquote deconstruction started from a very different place. But I think the other part is I just really took a lot of time to expose myself to other parts of Christianity outside of evangelicalism. And that's globally, but also just denominationally. Like I'm so nerdy that I read denominational confessions of faith for fun. Like it's just really interesting to me what everyone believes. And as I was searching for like what I believe, I wanted to see what other people who had thought about it longer than me had articulated. And so once I realized that, or I've also, for the last 3.5 years, I've been at a seminary that's a mainline seminary. So it's a completely different world. Like the people that I know, like the Christian celebrities I know, they have no idea who any of these people are. It's so crazy. But that was the first place that I was like, oh, okay, there's room for people like me in Christianity still, even with the social upheaval, because there are other traditions that have some of this more baked into their culture, more baked into their theology. And so it really sort of allowed me to make more of that distance, right? And make more of that space once I realized that there was space for me, even though I believed that it was possible. I didn't know it was actual, right? And so I think some of that, and then of course, like distance from my own deconstruction in a lot of ways gave me a little more space. And so I think I just wanted people to know that, ideas come from someplace, and there are people who at the same moment made a different choice in Christianity, and their traditions ended up different places. And so there are ways in which we can look at things and say, we might have something wrong, but I'm willing to continue to do this, or to consider multiple viewpoints and see that. And so I think I just wanted people to understand, like, some of like where the ideas that maybe they're struggling with come from, that we're seeing kind of in the zeitgeist right now, but then also that there are like other ways of looking at it, and that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing, right? And I think that's where people get caught up now, as they sort of feel like, well, if this isn't right, then nothing is right. And I think that's a really hard way to go through the world and through life. But I certainly don't think that to be true of Christianity. And maybe then that's probably also my personal bias there. But I think I wanted people to understand that there is sort of life outside of evangelicalism, even if they feel committed to evangelicalism, being introduced to other ideas or ways of looking at the Bible or culture or whatever. And so, I think I gave myself a lot of distance in order to do that. And then I just remembered like who I was writing for and what they needed to hear, and what they needed to process, and just offering alternatives, even if they land in a different place than I do, which I think is very possible. That we're going to need that. There needs to be a safe space to ask questions and have different ideas. And if I can like start pulling that thread for them, then, I'm just glad to be there.
Yeah. Well, and I think the book was really helpful. You actually walked people through a lot of, I think, common things that people start to have questions about. I mean, obviously the Bible, but even parables and traditions and spiritual practices and things that maybe they're used to, where they thought there was only the one way. But then you also broke down, I love this, like the language of Christianity, like Christianese, right?
Yeah.
So words like orthodoxy and inerrancy. And I feel like there's a lot of people that are like, yeah, right. Like I know what that is, but they're maybe not sure. So I wonder if that's part of people's confusion, is maybe they thought they understood what all these practices or terms were, but they weren't actually familiar with the meaning. Do you think that could be part of it?
I think that's part of it. And I think people use the terms in ways that aren't always accurate. And so, and I completely understand that language changes over time, but I also wanted people to understand like where it originally came from, like in inerrancy, right? For example, there are a lot of people who would say that the Bible is inerrant, who wouldn't hold to the strict definition that, it was originally and painstakingly drafted to mean. But there are a lot of people who do, but also don't know that all of that's in there. And so I think there's a sense of just kind of rewiring our language, and so that we understand what we're talking about. And I think that was hard too, because there are spectrums of all these things, or like a lot of people, even in orthodoxy, right? People confuse orthodoxy, I think, with traditional. And and so I get a lot of comments about that when I talk about orthodoxy, and I'm like, no, that's not what we're talking about. Right. So like, I was like, you can totally hold to that. And I'm still very traditional in a lot of ways, but orthodoxy is more important to me. And so I think there's, Yeah. I wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page with what I was talking about. So
Smart.
I needed to like at least clearly define things. But again, going back to like where ideas come from and why, our church culture had been shaped in certain ways, came from these things, from these ideas. And even if we don't know that history anymore, understanding that can help us understand where we are now and like what choices we could have made differently along the way.
Yeah. Well, it's part of that curiosity thing too, right? Like I've always said, I'm like, I don't care about history and I don't need to know where things came from and wars and this and that and blah, 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 blah. But as I've gone through my own like relearning, I have started to genuinely care. My microphone right now is propped up on my Jewish study Bible that I never expected I would like actually purchase these just for fun, because it helps us to understand where did things come from? Where did the ideas come from? Because that's why we believe now what we believe now, or because someone said it on Instagram and we were like, okay, well, we would just believe this, but
I was like, that sounds good. So
only one of those is right. Yeah. So the second part of the book takes us back into quote unquote practicing again. And a large part of this for people is finding a church where they either feel safe in their uncertainty or they feel like the church is actually aligning with whatever their new vision of Jesus is, right? So you've talked publicly on your social media about how hard it was for you to find a church again. What encouragement outside of just keep trying, just keep going to churches, what encouragement do you have for people who still feel lost without a church home?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is make sure you're actually ready. Like, I think a lot of people want to jump into that or like want to be ready. And so they try to force themselves.
That's really good.
And if you've sort of experienced something that, has in some way your body or your nervous system has experienced as trauma or traumatic, then it's going to be really hard for you and you're not going to be ready. And that might even like prolong the process. So I think there's a lot of like wisdom in taking your time. And even, if you want sort of to get to know churches in this time without having to like go into a building, or if you don't know what triggers you and things like that, like there's still online services that you can check out, which may be a little bit safer because you can actually like just turn it off. Or be in a safer like physical space while you do that. But so I think that's really first is like actually being ready instead of like forcing yourself to be ready. And then I think the other part is knowing what's important to you. Like we're at a church now where I'm not 100% on all of the theology that they share in the denomination. I, don't foresee myself pursuing ordination anywhere, but if I did, I don't think it would be within this denomination. But the church felt for us like a safe space. And I think, and it's one of those things, and it's so trite, right? When it's like, when and I think there is a sense that like, when but I think you need to know what your like red flags and green flags are. Like, what are the things that are really important to you, that are needs that you have? What are things that you're on the lookout for and you really want to ask a lot of questions about? Because I do think there's some environments that are like designed to make you feel good, but they're not necessarily what you're looking for. And so you kind of have to like rank things. Like for us, the theology was secondary to other things because we already know what we believe. We, have and I think that's one thing that evangelicalism is great at is like the head part of faith. And we were like, we want to be in a place that practices more with their hands around things that are really important to us right now. And so that's where we ended up looking. And, our church actually has a whole like class around deconstruction. And so there's a lot of people there's a lot of like, there's a real safe space to like explore and have questions. So if that's important to you, I think there are spaces that are more accommodating to that. But I think that it's really a sense of, I know people will say like, well, values is like a code word for politics. And I don't think that's necessarily true, at least in a church search, because I think there is a certain extent to which, you have to know what's important to you and you have to know the ways in which you want or need leaders to operate, or other things to operate in order for you to feel safe and good. And then because that's the only way that you'll be able to grow and thrive in it, in any sort of environment. And so, yeah, I think just being really careful and listening to yourself really closely and being ready to step into that will go a long way. So I think it's really just it is unfortunately trial and error. You do have to just keep going until you find a place. We were really lucky in that we joined a church within 6 months of leaving our other one.
Oh, wow.
But we were like ferocious about like going. Like our part-time job was finding a church at that point. So, because for us that was really important, but and there will be more loss and grieving along the way. Like we found one that we thought we were really considering joining. And then we asked a few questions that were important to us. And we're like, actually, this isn't the right thing. And even though we loved all the people and there was so much that we really liked about the church, we were like, okay, I know we've been going here 2 months, but it's time to like step out and do something different. And so that was really, really hard because when you think you're finally close and then you sort of lose everything, like you lose again, something you've been through. And
it doesn't make it easier just because you've done it already once.
Yeah.
Right.
And so you sort of have to be ready for that part of the journey too, that there will continue to be more like grief and hardship. Like it felt like we were breaking up, like with people along the way. Yeah. And so I mean, there is no easy answer. It's a real long process of figuring out what makes sense for you and for your family and your needs, and just being gentle with yourself along the way.
Yeah. I love the idea of watching online, like from the safe space of your home, because I think too, some people think they're ready and they're not. I also think that sometimes people think they know what their triggers are and then they don't.
Yeah.
So I would say to really pay attention to that, like in your red flag list, maybe even like write it down, like keep it in a notes and the notes app in your phone or something, because I think like I've talked to people who are like, oh, I want this, this, and that. And my no's are this, this, and that. But then when they visited a church, it was something completely different than they expected. And they didn't expect all of a sudden this emotion to come up because of, music or preaching style or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So paying attention to those for sure is a good tip. So for someone who has just started to find themselves in this process of disentangling or whatever we want to call it, I know it can be scary to hear the stories of people who deconstruct their way all the way out, right? So what tips do you have for someone who is like, I want to start relearning, I want to kind of start pulling at the threads, but I don't want to lose my faith?
I mean, I think then you've already made an important decision about your boundaries in the process. And I think that's important, right? Is sort of knowing, like for me, like Jesus wasn't a question. I was going to be sticking with that. And that was a foundation. I was like, if that's the foundation, now I want to make sure that everything else I've built on top of it is actually is strong enough. And so I think knowing your boundaries, and at some point you may decide that boundary needs to move, and that's okay too. But like knowing whatever your boundary is, like start there. And you don't have to do everything all at once. I think we all think everything has to happen all at the same time. That's just impossible.
Yes.
Like pick one thing that's really important, or unless that's terrifying to you, and then pick one thing that's not important, right? That you can just sort of like explore and test. Because then it's like, well, if I lose that, it's not a big deal. But it sort of may give you a sense of like what's happening next, right? What can come up in the process before you actually dive into some other things.
Yeah.
And then I think really it's again tuning into yourself. And when I say tune into yourself, I know that can feel very like woo-woo, but I also think it's very like, I think the Holy Spirit communicates, through us in a lot of those ways.
Yeah.
And that sometimes we've turned some of those things off because we've been taught to listen to other things, or that like some of the knowledge or experiences were so mediated by other people and outside factors that that we haven't necessarily tuned into that in a deep way in a long time. And so, I always tell someone, like, if you are trying to figure out if you're wanting to stick with this, like go to Jesus, go back to the Gospels, read through those, you don't even need fancy commentaries. You don't need any of that. Like, just read. And if you're not cool with this Jesus guy, then you kind of have your answer, right? And you sort of know how far you want to go or not go in that process. And I think that for me was really integral in just sort of like helping me adjust like the compass of my direction, so that I kind of knew that like this was the place that I'm sticking with, because I still feel really good about it. And now I feel myself tuning into that too. And I can let that guide. Like, I know we sort of want to think our way to our theology, but sometimes our gut goes that way, and our mind follows eventually. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, I like the idea too that you said, you just kind of go until you don't want to go. Like, there's no one tells you, hey, here's where the finish line is, and it's closer or farther away than you think. If you start a process of relearning and it's too much, you can just like put a pin in it for a little bit,
Yeah.
Go back to Jesus. I like that. That's good.
Hasn't failed me yet.
Yes. Same. Hallelujah. Okay, Kate, since the podcast is called Becoming Church, how can you encourage our listeners to live out being the church right now where they are, regardless of where they are in their journey back to Jesus?
I think it's remembering what it means to be the church. And I think that we often think of being the church as the internal functions of the church, right? Of the ways in which we're supposed to like pass down our tradition and, spiritually form our minds and our hearts. But I also think that when we do that, we lose the pieces of what it means for the external pieces of church. And I think for a lot of us, that's sort of the place that we've found we were sort of missing some of our experience. And so, like, just be the hands of justice, be the people that you believe the church ought to be. And I think in a lot of those ways, you'll probably find yourself in the circles of the churches that you want to be a part of, because you're participating in the work of the church as you see it. And so it doesn't have to be big. You don't have to change the world. You don't have to do any of that, right? Like, remove all of that pressure and just pick one way that you want to love people really well and do that. And I think in that, you'll find more ways to love people well, and that will keep spiraling out, Yeah.
Be the Christian that you wish you'd experienced, or that you wish you'd come in contact with. That's beautiful. What a perfect way to end. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Kate. I know you've got other resources besides the book, which we'll link up in the show notes. You've got other resources for people that want to connect with you more or learn more from you. Where can they find all that?
Yeah. So, gosh, where to start? I'm on social media. I'm on Twitter at @TheKateBoyd and on Instagram at kateboyd.co. I hang out mostly on Instagram. And then let's see, I've got a whole bunch of different resources. I've got a toolkit on how to read the Bible. I've got, if you're going through deconstruction or you're thinking about it, or you're wanting to know a little bit more in the mind of someone, I've got a limited series podcast that I did called the Messy Middle Christian Podcast, that you can find at kateboyd.co/messy. And then the toolkit is at kateboyd.co/Bible. So it's really easy to get all of those things. And then the book or my website in general, if you just are like, who is this person and what is she talking about? And if you're looking for all the things in one place, that's probably the easiest place to go.
And we'll link it up. We'll link it all up there. And I will tell you guys, go follow Kate. She is a fantastic follow for any kind of questioning, unlearning, relearning, all of the things. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This was great.
I hope this conversation with Kate Boyd has been helpful. Her book is a great tool for walking through whatever stage of deconstruction you're in. And also, let me remind you, this podcast is a ministry of Mosaic Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. We are a safe place. We are a community where you can come with your questions, with your doubts, with your confusions. So if you are someone anywhere nearby and you would like to show up on a Sunday morning, we would love to talk to you. We would love to welcome you in. You don't have to be certain on what you believe. You don't have to know the Bible. You don't need to understand these Christianese languages. If you are looking for a place where you can go toward Jesus and learn more about who he is and what it looks like to live your life with other people who are also imperfectly trying to do the best they can to live and love like him, we would love for you to be part of Mosaic. If you are looking for something online, you're not local to Charlotte, you can also join us on our live stream link, which will be linked up below. We hope this has been helpful, and we'll see you next time.